Our second scripture today is from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 38 to 42. Now, as they went on their way, he entered a certain village where a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. She had a sister named Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to what he was saying, but Martha was distracted by her many tasks. So she came to him and asked, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all of the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her." It's another familiar passage. For those of you who were here last week, we had a sermon on the passage of the Good Samaritan, one that everybody knows, and in large degree, often because they don't really understand that passage, they have really good feelings about it. Well, this passage, lots of people know, very few people have good feelings about it. As I was reading through the commentaries about this passage this week, I came across a statement again and again, and if the commentator happened to be a woman, it was always there. This is among my least favorite passages in the Bible. And I never preach on it, they would say. Many felt as if Martha here is being dissed by both her sister Mary and by Jesus. Because here is Martha. She's being hospitable. She's caring for others. She's being the responsible one. She's putting other people's needs above her own. She is building community, and she's doing everything that we're supposed to be doing. And Mary's just letting her go ahead. And Jesus basically says, yeah, what you're doing, Martha, it doesn't count for anything. Or at least that's how many people read it. In choosing a passage to preach on, if you're someone in the lectionary tradition, like I like to use passages from the lectionary, they would almost always choose the passage that Stacy read earlier over this one. There's so much good stuff there you could preach about, so much wonderful stuff that you could just grab. You could make a great sermon on that passage. And this one's just hard. And it's nasty, and it's got stuff that, let's not deal with that. We'll just preach on Colossians and let this one go by. And if you're in a tradition that doesn't use the lectionary, well, you don't even have to wrestle with that. You just ignore it altogether. Unless, of course, you want to put the women down, and there are preachers who go in that direction. We won't talk about them. And often the folk who do preach on this passage kind of skirt around Martha. They treat her as if she's just the setup character. She's not really in the center of anything. I've preached on this passage multiple times, and that's pretty much what I've done every time. I begin by affirming Martha. After all, every preacher I know would love to have 10 Marthas in her congregation. And I can look out here and I know which one of you are Marthas. And let me tell you, I am so thankful. I am so thankful. But then I very quickly move on to real meat in my mind of the passage. And usually it's talking about something like what I talked about with the kids, about paying closer attention to life, finding joy in the moment, being there and realizing the presence of God is with us and bathing in that and basking in that and listening for that still small voice and focusing our attention on what's really, truly important. Usually I kind of skirt around what that might be that's really, truly important, like leaving out the part about taking care of some other people. But in any case, that's usually the direction it goes. And I think if I was preaching that sermon, and I preached it a lot, and some of them have been pretty good sermons. I read them. If Martha was in the congregation, I can see her standing up and putting her hands on her hips and saying, "But what about me? What about me, preacher?" Well, I think it's a reasonable direction to go with the passage. But I didn't want to go that way this year. And so I read it a little harder and thought about it a little more. And another piece jumped out at me. And it struck me that there was a theme from last Sunday's passage to this. The Good Samaritan passage comes right before this. And it struck me that was a story where the expected people to be the heroes, the priest and the Levite, they were supposed to be the heroes. They weren't. And the person who was supposed to be the villain, the Samaritan, became the hero. And we saw in that passage this idea that Jesus is focusing his attention and lifting up the people who are the other, the people who are at the margins of society. And as I thought about that, I realized that's exactly what's going on in this passage today. We go from a passage where the hero is the other, the Good Samaritan, to a passage where the central characters are women in a world where women weren't really seen as whole people. And even among the women, the one who's doing the stuff that women are supposed to be doing, she seems to get dissed by Jesus. And the one who's doing the stuff that women are never supposed to do gets lifted up as the example of something positive. At least that's how most people read the passage. And I saw in it that, again, we have this central theme of Jesus lifting up the other, the outsider. And if we read the passage carefully, that theme becomes even more clear. You notice, maybe not. I tried to emphasize it when I read it. But it says, Martha welcomes Jesus into her home. Well, we know from other places in the scripture that Mary and Martha were two single women who lived with their single brother Lazarus. It was his house, not theirs. Women didn't own houses. And not only are we told that it's Martha's home rather than Lazarus, Lazarus doesn't even get mentioned. He's the man of the house. He's the one who provides for them. He's the one who owns the property. He's the one who's the real whole person, not them. He doesn't even get mentioned. Scandalous. Scandalous. Now you might say, well, maybe he didn't get mentioned because maybe Lazarus wasn't home. Maybe he was off on a business trip doing something. Let me tell you, that would have been even more scandalous. For two single women to welcome a man into the home when the man of the house isn't there, everybody would have been wagging their fingers and going, "Oh, do you see what they're... Oh, no. And those details would have been shockingly obvious to anybody who read this story at the time Luke wrote it down. They would have come directly from the Samaritan passage, scratching their heads saying, I don't know about this. This doesn't make any sense. And then they get to this thing, and here are two single women welcoming Jesus into their home. One of them's doing what women are supposed to do. The other one's... And not only... Well, she doesn't only do the things women are supposed to do. She's got the temerity to stand up and say, Jesus, do something about this. Don't you care? It was a shocking and scandalous passage. And that message wouldn't have been lost on anybody. Well, that would be a second really good sermon on this passage. But I'll tell you, I needed to hear something else today. I'm exhausted. I'm exhausted hearing about overt racism. I'm exhausted thinking about complicit behavior that doesn't call it out. I'm exhausted about the fact that we moved from dog whistles to just out there in your face, and I'm tired of it. I need something else. And that brought me back to Martha. Often she is seen as kind of an afterthought when you're preaching on this passage. She's seen as just kind of the setup character, and she's done her part, and she set Jesus up so that he can say what he wants to say, and she disappears from the scene, at least in our minds. But as I thought about her, I wanted to answer her question to me during my first sermon. I wanted to answer, what about me, preacher? You can't just wipe me out of this passage. What about me? What about me? Now, the reason many of the commentators don't like this passage is because not only do they want more Marthas in their churches, they also identify with Martha. We all do, don't we? Some in different ways. We all know that sense at times of being underappreciated, of feeling like we have been forced to be the responsible one when everybody else is shirking what they ought to do, and if we don't do it all, it's all just going to fall apart. I'm reminded of the old Russian proverb, the women do everything and the men do what is left. Well, sometimes even we men feel like that. Now I know the women are thinking, yeah, but you don't really deserve to feel like that. We do, and you're probably right. But her question of Jesus, don't you care, Lord? That's one that goes deeper yet, doesn't it? And this isn't the only place where Martha asks that question. Later on in the Gospels, we have the story of the brother is in this passage, and Lazarus gets ill. And Martha calls for Jesus. She sends a message. Jesus, come and heal my brother. He's really sick. We need you here now. And Jesus doesn't come. He delays. Who knows what he's doing? Doesn't sound very important in the passage. And while he's putzing around doing whatever he's doing, Lazarus dies. Then he decides to come. And Martha meets him on the street. Where have you been? She's a feisty one. Where have you been? Don't you care? If you had come a day earlier, my brother would still be alive. Don't you care? We needed you, Jesus. We needed you. It is a real question, isn't it? We have all asked that question of God at some point in our lives. Don't you care, God? Don't you care? If you really are a God of love, if you really are the one who's got the whole world in your hands, if you really are an all-powerful, all-present, all-knowing, all-loving God, why are things like this? Don't you care? Where did you go? Well, we've asked it on personal levels. Sometimes for ourselves, when other people aren't doing what they clearly ought to be doing and we end up suffering for it. That happens sometimes, doesn't it? Jesus, don't you care? Get them on track. Sometimes, like Martha, when we're looking at a loved one who is gravely ill, and we pray and we dream and we hope for healing and wholeness, and it doesn't seem to come, and we just want to, don't you care? Where are you, Jesus? Sometimes when it feels like the entire weight of the world is on our shoulders and they are just too small for that, don't you care, Lord? And sometimes it's not quite that personal. Sometimes it is much bigger. We look at a world that seems to be falling apart around us. This past week I've been reading these pieces from all of these scholars who study such things, who warn us that we are slipping very close to fascism. We look at political divides in our country that are as deep or deeper than perhaps they've been, except maybe in the 1960s and the 1860s. We look at the future and it feels insecure. We worry for our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. And we list out climate change, pollution, the possibility of a sixth great extinction, economic inequality, a changing economy where robots are taking many of the less skilled jobs and indeed some of the skilled jobs, racial tensions, populism on the rise, a world that seems to be fracturing around us, and it feels sometimes like Blade Runner is a much more realistic vision for the future than Star Trek. Don't you care, Lord? Don't you care? Well, I think Jesus' answer to Martha is multifaceted. He doesn't do what Martha wanted him to do. He doesn't do what would maybe satisfy us. He doesn't turn to Mary and say, Mary, go help your sister. Get in there, do it. Then when you're both done, then you can come back and sit down. But for right now, in there. But instead, he does a much more difficult answer. And you have to kind of tease it out. But when I read it, what I think he's really saying, and I think he's talking to Martha. He's saying, Martha, you get to make your own decisions. Martha, you get to decide where to put your energy, where to put your heart, where to put your love, where to put your time, where to put your dreams. You get to decide. Oh, and by the way, I'm right here with you the whole time. I'm right here with you the whole time. And I think that answer is the same one that comes to us anytime we ask, don't you care, Jesus? That we are given the opportunity to make decisions and to know that as we make the best decisions that we can, that we are never alone, that Jesus is with us. Now, that doesn't mean the tasks that need to get done go away. Martha could have said, you know what? You're right, Jesus. I'm going to sit down next to Mary and we're going to listen to what you have to say. And by the way, that chicken, it can cook itself. Or we're going to have chicken tartare. The tasks still need to get done. They're still before us. But we get to decide. We get to decide. Political divides, we can choose to work to heal them. It's not easy, not simple, but we can choose. Climate disaster avoided, we can make decisions to change that. To do right by the creation that God created and pronounced good, we can make that decision. We can. To build a future for our descendants, we can decide. And indeed, we do decide. We make those decisions. And through it all, Jesus is with us. When he says, Martha, Mary has chosen the good part, it's easy to say that, well, yeah, the good part is to sit down in front of Jesus' feet and just enjoy his presence. And maybe it is sometimes. But I think what he was really saying is, Martha, your sister Mary here has made a choice. And she's done that with all of the best stuff she can, and I'm going to bless that. Now, Martha, you make a choice. Make the best choice you can, and then you live with it, and you know that I'm there with you too. Who knows? Maybe if you can go back in that kitchen and start chopping up that chicken and start singing a little song, maybe I'll come in and help. I don't know, maybe. But whatever happens, know that I am with you. And the decisions are ours. And whatever choices we make, if we do the best that we can possibly do, we can do that knowing that God is with us in and through it all.